Emily Carter pressed her father's signed paper flat against the table with both hands, and she did not cry. She had used up every tear she owned the night her mother died, and she had none left for this, a single sheet of paper that said she was worth $2. If you've ever been told your pain doesn't matter, stay right here because this story is for you. Subscribe to this channel, follow Emily's story all the way to the end, and drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this voice travels. Henry Carter had been a miner once, a real one, the kind who came home with black dust packed so deep into the creases of his knuckles that Sunday scrubbing couldn't reach it, the kind who set his lunch pail by the door and kissed his wife on the cheek before she could say a word. That was before the shaft collapse at Grady's Ridge took 2 of his fingers and all of his nerve. That was before Eleanor died in February, coughing herself hollow in a bed that still smelled like lavender from the sachets she used to keep under the pillow. That was before little Thomas, age 4, followed his mother into the ground. Not 3 weeks later, the same fever, the same rattling chest, the same lamp burning low beside a bed Emily couldn't pull herself away from. After that, Henry Carter stopped being a miner. He stopped being much of anything. He became a man who sat on the porch in the same chair day after day, with a bottle between his knees and the mountain above him, going from green to gold, to brown to white, and back to green again, while he watched none of it. He became a man who forgot to eat unless Emily put the plate directly in his hands. He became a man who talked to Eleanor in the dark, low and slurring, as though she had just stepped out to the well and would be back directly. Emily did not hate him for it. She had tried in the early months. She had stood in doorways and watched him drink himself past the point of conversation and felt something hot and tight building behind her sternum, something that wanted to be rage. But rage requires energy, and Emily's energy went elsewhere, to the woodpile, to the cook fire, to the mending, to hauling water from the creek, with her bad leg dragging behind her in the mud, leaving a small uneven furrow in the earth the way it always had, the way it always would. She had been born with the leg wrong. Her mother had explained it gently when Emily was old enough to ask, sitting her down at the kitchen table with both hands wrapped around Emily's, and saying it the way you say something that you want to hurt as little as possible. The Lord made you a little different, sweetheart. That doesn't make you less. Eleanor Carter had believed that with her whole heart. Emily had believed it because her mother did. But Eleanor was gone, and the world outside their hollow had its own opinions. Blackwater Hollow sat in a crease of the Virginia mountains that the summer sun only found for about 4 hours each day before the ridgeline cut it off. In July, the air down in the hollow was still and thick with creek smell and the sound of insects that never quite shut up from dusk to dawn. The nearest town was Grady's Crossing, 4 miles down a road that turned to boot-sucking mud every time it rained, which in summer was nearly every afternoon. Emily had made that walk 100 times. She knew exactly which stones to step on, which roots would hold her weight where the road curved and the footing went soft. Her bad leg had never stopped her from making the walk. It just made it slower. She had made it that morning, in fact. Down to Grady's Crossing, to the dry goods store where Mr. Pell had let her credit run 3 months past due because he was a decent man and he knew what had happened to the Carter family. She had picked up flour salt, a small piece of fatback, and a tin of coffee that she couldn't really afford, but that she bought anyway, because the one thing that still seemed to reach her father through the fog of whiskey and grief was the smell of coffee in the morning. She had put it all on credit. She didn't know how she would settle. She had come back up the hollow road with the goods wrapped in cloth under her arm, her leg pulling the sweat gathering at the back of her neck in the July heat, and she had found her father sitting not in his usual chair, but at the kitchen table. He was sitting up straight. That should have been the first warning. Henry Carter had not sat up straight in over a year. "Emily," he said when she came through the door. "Papa." She set the goods on the counter and began unwrapping them. "You're up early. Sit down." She looked at him over her shoulder. He wasn't drinking, that was the second warning. The bottle was on the table in front of him, but it was corked, and his hands were flat on either side of it, and he was looking at her with an expression she couldn't immediately name. It wasn't shame exactly. It was something that had been worn down past shame into something duller and more final. She sat. "We're behind," he said. "I know, Papa. Pell's not going to hold our credit much longer. I'll speak with him again." "I spoke with someone," Henry said. He cut across her the way he never used to, blunt and fast, the way a man cuts across a thing he knows he has to say before he loses the will to say it. "A man named Langford. Victor Langford, out of Beckley. He came up here 2 days ago while you were at the Hendersons washing." Emily went still. "I don't know that name," she said. "No reason you would. He does business. Different kinds of business." Henry picked up the bottle, looked at it, set it down again without uncorking it. "He heard about our situation. I don't know how. Word gets around, I suppose, about a man who can't work and a girl who can't—" He stopped. Started again. "He made an offer." "What kind of offer?" Henry didn't answer immediately. He looked at the table. He looked at his 2 remaining fingers on his right hand, the ones the shaft collapse had left him, and he turned them over once, like he was checking they were still there. "Papa," Emily said. Her voice had gone very flat. "What kind of offer?" "He said he could take you on, give you work, at his establishment, in Beckley." "What kind of establishment?" The silence that followed was not empty. It was full of everything Henry Carter could not bring himself to say out loud, and Emily sat across the table from him and let it fill the room, and waited while her heart did something slow and terrible inside her chest. "Papa," she said, "look at me." He didn't. "Look at me." He raised his eyes. They were bloodshot and red-rimmed and sunken, and in them she could see the man he used to be, retreating like a tide going out, getting smaller and smaller, and she understood in that moment with a clarity that was almost peaceful that he had already made his decision. That this conversation was not him asking, it was him telling. "He's paying $2, Henry said. "It's not, I know it's not, but with that and what I can maybe make doing odd work for Pell." $2, Emily said. "Emily, he is paying you $2. She said it again, not as a question, not as an accusation, just as a thing she needed to hear out loud to make it fully real. "For me." Henry's jaw worked. "It's a business arrangement. He said it's all legal. There's a contract. A contract." She stood up from the table. Her leg made the movement uneven, always uneven, and she gripped the chair back while she found her balance, and she looked down at her father. Her father, the man who had called her his sunshine girl, who had carried her on his shoulders up to the ridge on summer evenings, so she could see the whole valley spread out gold below them, and she said very quietly, "You are selling me, Emily, for $2. It's not like that." "Then tell me," she said, "what it's like." He couldn't. He looked back down at the table, and the silence came back, and this time it stayed. Emily walked to the window. The hollow was bright with July morning, the creek catching light between the trees, a cardinal working through the underbrush and throwing his red against all that green, and she stood with her hand on the sill and breathed and thought about her mother. She thought about Eleanor's hands, always busy, always warm. She thought about Thomas, who had been afraid of thunder and who used to crawl into her bed and press his small, cold feet against her shins until she yelped and he giggled. She thought about the fact that she was 19 years old and she had never in her life done anything wrong. Not one truly wrong thing. And she was standing in her mother's kitchen, being told her value was $2. She did not cry. She turned around. "When does he come back?" she said. Henry blinked. Tomorrow morning." "Then I'm going to sleep," Emily said. "And in the morning, I'm going to say what I have to say. And whatever happens after that, Papa, you're going to have to live with it. Not me, you." She walked past him to the back room where she slept, and she closed the door, and she sat on the edge of her cot in the dark, and she held herself very still for a very long time.
narrated.
Victor Langford arrived at 8:30 the following morning, while the dew was still thick on the hollow grass, and the heat hadn't yet built to its midday weight. He came in a buggy black lacquered wood, a good horse, a driver in a clean vest who stayed on the seat and didn't speak. Langford himself climbed down and straightened his coat and looked up at the Carter cabin with the expression of a man doing arithmetic in his head. He was perhaps 50 lean in the way that men who have never missed a meal can choose to be lean with silver at his temples and a careful, measured way of moving. That Emily, watching from the window, recognized immediately as the movement of a man who had learned long ago that deliberateness creates authority. She had dealt with men like him exactly never. She understood them anyway. He knocked. Henry opened the door. "Mr. Carter?" Langford removed his hat. Not out of courtesy, as a demonstration of manners, which is a different thing. "I trust you've spoken with your daughter." "I have," Henry said. "And she's—" Henry glanced back into the cabin. "She's here." Langford stepped inside without being invited, which told Emily everything she needed to know about how he saw this interaction. He looked around the cabin with the same arithmetic expression cataloging. Then his gaze found Emily standing beside the fireplace, with her hands clasped in front of her, and he looked at her the way she had been looked at all her life by certain people, the leg first, then the rest of her, the assessment happening in a sequence that made the leg the leading fact and everything else secondary. "Miss Carter," he said. He put a slight warmth into his voice, the kind of warmth that is a technique. "I hope your father has explained my offer." "He has?" Emily said. "I have some questions." Langford glanced at Henry, then back at Emily, recalibrating slightly. "Of course." "What kind of work?" she said. "Hospitality. The Silver Lantern is a social establishment. We host gentlemen from the mining operations, the rail line, the county offices. Ladies in our employ provide companionship, conversation, comfort." "Comfort," Emily repeated. "It is a respectable house," Langford said with the measured confidence of a man who has said this sentence many times. "Our ladies are well kept, well fed. They have room and board and a percentage of their earnings. And if I don't want to be comfortable," Emily said to the gentleman, "if I decide I'd rather leave." Something moved behind Langford's eyes. It was brief and controlled, and he covered it smoothly. "Well," he said, "there would be the matter of the contract, of the initial payment to your father, which would need to be settled before you could make other arrangements. So I'd owe you the $2 back, plus room and board accrued, plus the expense of the journey. These things add up, Miss Carter. It is not meant as a hardship. It is simply how business is conducted." Emily looked at her father. Henry was looking at the floor. "Sign it then," Emily said. Both men looked at her. "Papa," she said, "if you're going to do this, do it in front of me. I want to see your hand make the mark. I want to know you didn't do it in the dark while I was sleeping like something you were ashamed of." The color came into Henry's face, then not anger. Something worse than anger, something that looked like a man seeing himself clearly for perhaps the first time in a year, and not being able to stand the view. His hand was shaking when he took the pen that Langford produced from his coat. It shook when he pressed it to the paper. It shook when he drew the unsteady scratching of his name. Emily watched every second of it. When it was done, Langford folded the paper and put it back in his coat. "We'll leave within the hour," he said to Henry, not to Emily. "She'll need to pack," Henry said. His voice had gone strange. "Of course." Langford replaced his hat. "We're not unreasonable people, Mr. Carter." He went back to the buggy. The door swung shut behind him, and it was just the two of them, and the cabin was very quiet. Henry stood with his back to Emily, his head bowed, the pen still in his hand. "Emily," he started. "Don't," she said. I need you to know I didn't—" "Don't, Papa." She said it again, quieter this time. Not unkind, just final. "Save it. Keep it right here." She crossed to the back room, pulled her mother's old canvas bag from under the cot, and began putting into it the things that were hers. The small wooden box with the lock of Thomas's hair, the photograph of her parents on their wedding day, her mother's Bible with the cracked spine, and the pressed wildflowers between psalms, her second dress, her winter stockings, the good wool blanket. She moved through the packing methodically, and she did not look at her father when she came back through the main room, and she walked through the door and out into the July morning, and she did not look back at the cabin. But at the edge of the hollow, just before the path turned, and the cabin would have gone out of sight anyway, she stopped. She stood there in the morning heat, with the bag over one shoulder and the sound of the creek behind her, and she looked up at the ridgeline above the hollow, the high blue ridge where her father used to carry her when she was small, and she thought, "I am not done." She could not have said what she meant by it exactly. It was not a plan. It was not even a hope, not really. It was something more fundamental than hope, something more like a refusal. A flat, bone-deep, quiet refusal to accept that this was the whole of her story. That a paper signed by a shaking hand and a man with a warm manufactured voice had written the end of Emily Carter before she had gotten fairly started. She was not done. She turned and walked to the buggy. The road from Blackwater Hollow to Beckley took the better part of the day, and Victor Langford was a man who believed in the power of silence used strategically. He sat across from Emily in the buggy's interior with his hands folded on his knee and said almost nothing for the first 3 hours, which Emily understood as a technique. Let the reality of the situation settle. Let the weight of distance and direction do its work. Let the girl come to terms on her own so that she arrives already broken in. She watched the mountains go by. The summer had the Virginia high country in full green, the kind of green that seems almost aggressive. Every slope covered thick and deep, the ridges rolling away into blue haze in every direction. It was beautiful. She had always found it beautiful, even on the hard days, even on the days when the hollow felt like it was closing in. The mountains did not care about $2 contracts. The mountains had been there before Victor Langford was born, and would be there after he was dust. She found that thought more steadying than she expected. Langford spoke at last, somewhere past the second ridge. "You are quieter than most girls," he said, not unkindly, observationally. Emily said. "Most girls cry." "Most girls," Emily said, "probably weren't watching for it as long as I was." He looked at her with the arithmetic expression. "You knew your father would do it." "I knew he was drowning," she said. "Drowning men reach for whatever's closest." Langford was quiet for a moment. "You are not what I expected, Miss Carter." "No," she said. "I don't suppose I am." She looked back out at the mountains, and she kept her face still, and she kept her mind moving, not panicking, not grieving, not yet, but working, cataloging, observing. She watched where the road turned. She watched where the ridges offered cover. She watched which farms they passed and whether there were people in the fields. She did not know what she was building with these observations, not yet. She was building a picture, though. She was building the picture that a person builds when they have decided, without quite saying it to themselves, that they are going to find a way out. When the buggy rolled into Beckley, as the afternoon was dying into early evening, and the main street was lit up with lanterns, and the smell of summer dust and horse and cook fire and human noise came through the window, Emily straightened her back against the seat and exhaled slowly. Wherever this road was going, she was going with her eyes open. That she had decided was the one thing they could not take from her. Her eyes. The Silver Lantern sat on a side street off Beckley's main thoroughfare, and it was exactly what a man like Victor Langford would build. Handsome enough to suggest class, discreet enough to avoid scrutiny with lamplight in every window. That from the outside looked warm and inviting, and from the inside, Emily would learn, was the kind of warmth specifically calibrated to soften judgment. Margaret Doyle met them at the door. She was a large woman, not fat but solid built, with the density of someone who had spent a long time making herself immovable, and she wore black with a cameo at her throat, and her gray hair pinned back with a severity that matched her expression. She looked at Emily the way Langford had looked at the cabin cataloging calculating, but where Langford did it with arithmetic, Doyle did it with something older and sharper, experience. The look of a woman who had seen 100 Emilys come through that door. "She's thin," Doyle said to Langford. "She'll eat," Langford said. "And the leg? Not my concern. Yours." Doyle looked at Emily directly then for the first time, and something passed across her face that was not quite pity and not quite recognition, but lived somewhere in the neighborhood of both. "Come inside," she said, not unkindly, just flatly. Emily came inside. The house was quiet at this hour. The evening trade hadn't begun. The front parlor was furnished with the kind of deliberate care that wants you to think of drawing rooms and respectability, heavy curtains and upholstered chairs and a piano against one wall. It smelled of rose water and tobacco and something underneath both of those things that Emily couldn't name, but her body knew instinctively, a smell that made her spine go very straight. Doyle took her upstairs to a small room at the end of the hall. "This is yours," she said. "You share the water pitcher. Meals are at 7 and noon. You'll meet the other girls tonight." "Mrs. Doyle," Emily said. The woman stopped in the doorway. "I want you to know," Emily said, looking around the small room with its narrow bed and its single window, "that I am here because I had no other choice at the moment. That's different from being here because I accepted this. Do you understand the difference?" Doyle looked at her for a long moment. "Honey," she said, and for just a second, the flatness in her voice shifted into something that had a texture like old scar tissue. "I understand the difference better than you'll ever know." She pulled the door partially closed. "Get some rest. It starts tonight." The door clicked. Emily stood in the middle of her small room, and she looked at the window. The single window, the square of evening sky going purple beyond the glass, and she pressed the heel of her hand flat over her sternum, over the thing that was beating hard and frightened underneath, and she said very quietly to no one, "I am not done." The summer dark came down over Beckley, and the silver lantern's lamps came up. And somewhere in the mountains 4 miles north and east of town, a man Emily Carter had never met, and would not meet for some time yet, sat outside his cabin in the last of the evening light, with a cup of coffee cooling in his hand, listening to the ridge go quiet. His name was Caleb Morgan, and he had learned the hard way to listen when things stopped making noise. The first night Emily didn't sleep. She lay on the narrow bed with her hands folded on her stomach and her eyes on the ceiling, and she listened to the house move around her footsteps in the hall. A door closing, a man's low laugh that came up through the floorboards and made her jaw tighten. She counted the sounds the way her mother used to count stitches, methodically, keeping her hands from shaking by keeping her mind busy. She had decided somewhere in the hours between Langford's buggy rolling into Beckley and Margaret Doyle pulling that door partially closed that panic was a luxury she could not afford. Panic was for people who still believed things might go back to the way they were. Emily had understood by the time the hollow road disappeared behind the first ridge that nothing was going back. The only direction available was forward, and forward required clear eyes and a functioning mind, and neither of those things survived panic intact. So she didn't panic. She listened, and she counted, and she waited for morning. Morning came gray and close, the July heat already building before the sun had properly cleared the ridgeline. She heard the house stirring water running. Someone coughing the smell of bacon fat working up through the floorboards from somewhere below. She washed her face from the shared pitcher, put on her second dress, braided her hair the way her mother had taught her, and sat on the edge of the bed with her hands in her lap and waited. The knock came at 7:30. "Breakfast," a voice said through the door. Young, female, a little flat the way voices go flat when they've stopped expecting much from the world. Emily opened the door. The girl in the hallway was perhaps 17, with dark circles under eyes that had once probably been pretty, and might be again if she got enough sleep for about 6 months straight. She had a yellow dress on that was nicer than anything Emily owned, and wore it the way you wear something that belongs to someone else. She looked at Emily the way people look at new arrivals, anywhere sizing up guarded, not unfriendly, but not committed to friendly either. "You're the new one," the girl said. "Emily Carter. Rose." She didn't offer a last name. Emily noted that. "Come on. Margaret doesn't like waiting." Emily followed her down the hall and the stairs into a back dining room she hadn't seen the night before. Plain table, 6 chairs, 3 other girls already seated when they came in. She cataloged them the same way she'd cataloged the road out of Blackwater Hollow ages, ranging from perhaps 16 to mid-20s, varying states of the same hollowed alertness, the kind of quiet that is not peaceful, but exhausted. Margaret Doyle sat at the head of the table with coffee and a ledger. She did not look up when Emily and Rose came in. "Sit," she said. Emily sat. Doyle turned a page in the ledger. "Miss Carter, you'll spend today observing. I'll explain how this house operates, what is expected, and what is not permitted. You will not begin working until I determine you're ready. That is not kindness, that is economics. An unprepared girl costs me more than she earns." "What counts as ready?" Emily asked. Every girl at the table looked at her. Doyle did look up. Then her gray eyes moving to Emily with the measured patience of a woman who has learned that the new ones always ask too many questions, and the only real variable is whether they stop on their own or have to be helped to stop. "Ready," Doyle said, "means you understand the rules of this house, you understand what the clients expect, and you understand that what happens inside these walls stays inside these walls. That last one is the most important. And if something happens inside these walls that I don't want to stay inside these walls..." The room went very still. Rose beside her made a small movement with her hand under the table. A warning. Emily felt it but didn't look away from Doyle. Doyle closed the ledger, set her coffee down, and looked at Emily with the expression of a woman recalibrating something she thought she had already figured out. "Miss Carter," she said, "you signed a contract." "My father signed a contract," Emily said. "I watched his hand shake when he did it." "The legal effect is the same, is it?" Emily said it as a statement, not a question, and held Doyle's gaze, and in the silence between them, something was established that neither of them named, but both of them knew. Emily was not going to be the kind of girl who looked at her plate. She was not going to be hollowed by degrees without Doyle, and by extension, Langford knowing exactly what they were doing and to whom. Doyle picked up her coffee again. "Eat your breakfast," she said. "We'll begin this afternoon." Emily ate. She watched the other girls while she did it, and she understood within about 10 minutes that there was a social architecture here as deliberate as anything Langford had built. Rose was the newest before Emily 4 months. By the way, the others deferred to her on small things, while not quite trusting her on larger ones. A girl called Clara had been here longest, maybe 2 years, and it showed in the way she moved through the space, with a kind of terrible ease, the way you learn to be easy in a place because fighting it costs too much. A girl called Nettie was the quietest, with a way of watching the door every time it opened that told Emily she was still counting exits, still running calculations, still holding on to something. After breakfast, Doyle walked Emily through the house. It was thorough and brisk and delivered with the same flat efficiency as everything else. The woman did here is the parlor. Here is how the evening begins. Here are the expectations of the clients. Here is what you do. If a client becomes difficult, here is what you do not do under any circumstances. She laid it all out like a set of surveying stakes, marking the boundaries of the territory Emily now occupied. Emily listened and said nothing and stored everything. At one point, passing the parlor, Doyle stopped. "That piano," she said, nodding at the upright against the wall. "Do you play?" "Some," Emily said. Her mother had taught her. "Why?" "Because girls who play are useful in ways beyond the obvious." Doyle's voice was as uninflected as ever, but there was something in the practicality of the statement, something that was in its own bleak way, information. A way to be useful that was not the other way. A currency Emily hadn't known she had. "I can play well enough," Emily said. "We'll see," Doyle said and moved on. And that night, Emily sat in the corner of the parlor in a dress that wasn't hers, blue nicer than anything she'd ever owned, and fitting that detail about Langford's operation. And she watched the evening begin. Men came in through the front door in ones and twos, miners, mostly some railroad men, a few who wore the clothes of clerks or minor officials and carried themselves with the self-conscious dignity of men who spent their days making small decisions and came here at night to feel powerful. Langford circulated with a drink in his hand, and the warm manufactured voice turned up to its evening setting, smooth and expansive. The host of a respectable establishment, absolutely. The girls moved through it all with a practiced fluency that made Emily's chest hurt. Not because they looked unhappy exactly, but because they looked careful. Every smile measured. Every laugh timed. They had learned to perform ease so thoroughly that it was impossible to tell from the outside what was left underneath the performance. Rose appeared at Emily's elbow at some point in the first hour. "You're watching too hard," she said quietly, her eyes on the room. "I'm learning," Emily said. "Learning and watching are different things here. Watching makes them nervous, makes Langford nervous." "Good," Emily said. Rose made a small sound that wasn't quite a laugh. "You're going to get yourself hurt." "Maybe." Emily picked up the glass of lemonade that had been put in her hand earlier by one of the kitchen girls and held it without drinking. "Or maybe I'm going to figure out exactly how this operates and find the weak spot." Rose was quiet for a moment. "There isn't one," she said finally, but she said it the way people say things they're hoping to be contradicted on. Emily didn't contradict her, not yet. She didn't have enough information yet, but she turned the word over in her mind, weak spot, and she held it there the way you hold a lamp up against a seam in a wall looking for where the dark gets thin. The evening went on. A man approached her, heavy middle-aged, with the careful politeness of someone who has been told to be polite and is being polite as a demonstration of willingness to comply with instructions. He asked her name, asked where she was from, said something about the mountains that was meant to be charming. Emily answered each question with exactly the words required, and no more. She smiled when the situation called for it, and let the smile stop at her eyes. She was polite. She was careful. She did not under any circumstances let herself think about Blackwater Hollow, or her father's shaking hand, or her mother's Bible packed in the canvas bag upstairs, because if she thought about those things, she would not be polite and careful. She would be something else entirely. At the end of the night, back in her room, she sat on the bed and pressed both palms flat against her knees and breathed. Then she reached under the mattress where she'd tucked the canvas bag, pulled out her mother's Bible, and held it against her chest with both hands. "Tell me what to look for, Mama," she said to the dark. The dark didn't answer, but in the morning it did. Because in the morning, Langford himself came to find her. He knocked with 2 knuckles, the proprietary knock of a man who owns the door. Emily opened it and found him standing in the hall in his morning clothes, still carrying the authority he wore like a coat, even before he'd properly put one on. He looked at her with the arithmetic expression and said, "Mrs. Doyle tells me you play piano." "Some," Emily said again. "Play for me, or go." It was not a request. She recognized that. She followed him downstairs to the parlor, which was empty and bright in the morning light, and she sat at the piano bench with Langford standing behind her, and she played. She played the hymn her mother had taught her first, "Be Thou My Vision," because it was what her hands knew best, and because she could not think of anything that said more clearly to anyone paying attention, "I am not what you think I bought." When she finished, Langford said nothing for a moment. Then, "You're better than some." "I practice," Emily said. She kept her hands on the keys. "You'll play in the evenings, before the girls come down. Sets the atmosphere." He moved toward the door. "It also means you spend less time on other duties. For now." For now. Emily watched his back as he left, and she understood what he had just done. He had offered her a foothold not out of generosity, out of calculation. A girl who played piano was more valuable at the piano than elsewhere, at least at the beginning while the novelty of it still drew the clients in. He was managing his investment. She was a $2 investment he was trying to make worth more. She turned back to the piano, and she began playing again slowly this time, working through the keys with something close to deliberateness. He had just shown her without meaning to that she had something he wanted that was not what he'd paid for. That was the first crack. She would find more. 3 weeks into the Silver Lantern, the temperature in Beckley cracked over 100 degrees for 4 days straight, and the whole town got mean with it. Men, shorter-tempered horses, skittish the evening trade, louder and less controlled than usual. On the 3rd night of the heat, a man named Callum Briggs, who was a foreman at one of the rail operations, and who had been coming to the Silver Lantern for about a year, and who believed that money entitled him to a particular kind of treatment, decided that Emily's careful, measured piano-playing distance was a thing he intended to personally dismantle. He waited until Langford was occupied at the far end of the parlor. He came to the piano bench. He put his hand on her shoulder. Emily stopped playing. She went very still for exactly 2 seconds, which is what it took her to assess the situation fully. The weight of his hand, Langford's location, where the nearest exit was where Doyle was, and whether anyone in the room was watching. Then she turned on the bench and looked directly into Callum Briggs's face and said in a voice pitched low enough that only he could hear it, "Take your hand off my shoulder, Mr. Briggs, right now." He smiled, the smile of a man who has mistaken the direction of power in a room. "Now, honey." "I am not your honey," Emily said, still quietly, still precisely. "I am the girl who plays piano, and I will stop playing piano the moment you don't take your hand off my shoulder, and every man in this room who came here in part because the music makes the evening nicer will know exactly why the music stopped. Take your hand off my shoulder." The smile flickered. His hand moved. He stepped back from the bench and gave her a look that had something ugly in it, not rage, something more sour than rage, the look of a man who has been publicly put in his place by someone he'd categorized as powerless and cannot process the recategorization, and he walked away. Emily turned back to the piano and began playing again without pausing, without adjusting her posture, without giving anyone watching the satisfaction of seeing her hands shake. They didn't shake. She was surprised to discover that. They absolutely should have. Rose appeared beside the piano 20 minutes later, refilling a drink, and said without looking at Emily, "Briggs went to talk to Langford." Emily kept playing. "I know." "You know what that means. He'll have a conversation with me tomorrow morning." Emily moved from the hymn she'd been playing into something lighter, something the room could feel without quite naming. "And I'll have a conversation with him." "Emily." Rose's voice had dropped further, lost the performance overlay entirely. "Langford doesn't like girls who make the clients feel small." "Briggs made himself feel small," Emily said. "I just didn't stop him." Rose looked at her for a moment with an expression that was complicated, frightened, and something else, something that sat underneath the fright, like bedrock. Then she moved back into the room with the drink, and Emily played until Doyle came to close the evening, and the men filed out into the hot Beckley night. Langford came in the morning as predicted. He sat across from her in the back dining room with his coffee and his ledger, and the warm voice turned down to its business setting, and he explained in measured terms that the clients expected a certain accessibility. "I understand that," Emily said. "Then you understand that—" "I understand that a man who grabs a woman at a piano in front of a room full of people has just told every other man in that room that the woman can be grabbed," Emily said. "And I understand that that is bad for your business, Mr. Langford, not just bad for me, because if the Silver Lantern is a place where men can put their hands wherever they please without being told otherwise, then the men who come here for the atmosphere, the clerks, the officials, the men who want to feel they're somewhere respectable, those men will stop coming. And they're the ones who spend the most." Langford looked at her over his coffee. Emily looked back. "I didn't tell Briggs he couldn't touch me," she said. "I told him not to touch me without my consent. That is a different thing, and it is a thing that in a well-run house every client understands going in." She let that sit for a second. "Is this a well-run house, Mr. Langford?" The silence stretched. Langford put his coffee down, and for the first time since she had watched him step out of the black lacquered buggy in Blackwater Hollow, the arithmetic expression shifted into something that was briefly and without warmth a species of respect, the kind of respect that recognizes a worthy opponent. "You are," he said slowly, "not what I expected." "So I've been told," Emily said. He said nothing more about Briggs. He didn't stop the morning conversation from happening again. He simply noted it in the ledger Emily suspected and recategorized her the way he recategorized everything according to its utility. That was the second crack. A month in, she had the other girls. Not their loyalty, not yet. But she had their attention, which was the first step. Clara, who had been there longest, started talking to her after Doyle went to bed one night, sitting in the hallway outside Emily's room with her knees pulled up and her voice low. She talked about a farm in West Virginia, about a man she'd been going to marry, about a series of events that had taken her from the farm to Beckley, the way a river takes you not by force at each individual moment, but by accumulation of current, until you look up and the bank is too far. Emily listened and said very little, and let Clara talk herself all the way to the end of the thing, to the place Clara had apparently not gotten in a long time. "Do you ever think about getting out?" Emily asked when Clara had wound down. Clara looked at her. "Out how?" "I don't know yet," Emily said. And that was the truth. "But I'm thinking." "Langford has the contract." "Langford has a piece of paper," Emily said. "Contracts can be contested, especially contracts signed under duress or contracts that bind someone to terms they weren't present to negotiate." She had been thinking about this for weeks, turning it over at the piano in the mornings when the house was still working through what she knew about law from overhearing her father and other minors argue about claim disputes back in the Hollow. It wasn't much, but it was something. "I need to know if there's a lawyer in Beckley." Clara stared at her. "You're serious?" "As of February morning," Emily said. Clara thought for a long moment. "Simmons," she said. "Hale Simmons. He's on the main street." "But Emily—" She stopped, started again. "Langford has friends in this town, the magistrate, 2 of the county commissioners. If you go to Simmons, and Simmons talks to anyone—" "Then I'll have to be careful about how I go," Emily said. The thing was, she didn't yet know how. She had the destination, and not the road. But the destination was clear enough that she could hold it in her mind through the evenings, through the men, and the managed smiles, and the piano, and the careful navigation of a house full of invisible rules. She held it the way you hold a lamp, not so tight you put it out. On a Wednesday in the 6th week, Nettie disappeared. She was there at breakfast and gone by noon. Her room cleared, her few things vanished. The only sign she'd been in the house at all. A small blue ribbon Emily found under the washstand when she helped Doyle change the room. Doyle said nothing about it. The other girls said nothing about it, with the careful nothing saying of people who have learned that questions about certain topics cost more than the answers are worth. Emily asked Rose that night quietly at the edge of the parlor. Rose looked at the floor. "She tried to leave," she said. "3 weeks ago. Got as far as the East Road before Langford's driver found her. And then—" Rose shook her head. Emily looked at the room. Langford in the corner, the warmth and the lamplight, the careful architecture of it all. And she felt for the first time since the buggy left the Hollow, something that was closer to fear than anything she'd allowed herself before. Not fear of the physical, fear of the clock, of time running out before she found the road she was looking for, of the silver lantern doing to her what it had done to Clara, making her easy in a place because fighting it costs too much. She could not let that happen. She went back to the piano that night, and she played until Doyle closed the room, and in the last 20 minutes, she played something she'd never played in that house before, a piece her father had loved. Before the grief swallowed him whole. Something old and Scots-Irish, and full of the mountains, full of the high ridgeline and the long view. She played it as precisely and clearly as she knew how, and she didn't perform it for the room. She played it for the girl she'd been in Blackwater Hollow, who had looked up at the ridge and said, "I am not done." She was not done, but she needed help. And 3 days later she found out entirely by accident that help was coming, though not in any form she could have predicted, and not before the worst night of her 6 weeks at the Silver Lantern was about to land on her like a fist. Because Callum Briggs came back. He came on a Friday, which was the busiest night, when Langford was occupied with a table of railroad men in the back room, and Doyle was managing the upstairs, and the parlor was loud and warm, and the girls were stretched thin, keeping up with the evening. He came in with 2 other men. Emily didn't know, and he had the particular look of a man who has spent 3 weeks turning a small humiliation over in his mind until it became something that required addressing. He went straight to the piano. He didn't put his hand on her shoulder this time. He put it on the piano keys, flat, covering the register she was playing and silencing the music all at once. The room noticed. The noise of conversation kept going, but the ambient attention of every person in the space shifted the way a room's attention always shifts when the music stops unexpectedly. Emily took her hands off the keys and looked at him. "Mr. Briggs," she said. "You embarrassed me," Briggs said. He wasn't bothering to keep his voice down. "In front of men I work with." "You made a choice," Emily said. "I responded to it." "You're a $2 girl," Briggs said. He said it loudly with deliberate ugliness, and Emily heard the room change temperature around the words, a few men looking away, a few leaning in. "Your father sold you for less than a good saddle blanket. You don't get to—" He didn't finish the sentence, because the front door opened. The man who came through it was tall, not in the exaggerated way of men who know they're tall, but in the way of someone who simply is what he is and has never given it much thought. He wore trail clothes, summer dusty, a hat he hadn't taken off yet, and he came in out of the July dark with the ease of a man who enters rooms without calculating whether he belongs in them. He stopped just inside the door, looking for the bar, and then his gaze moved the way a calm man's gaze moves when he comes into a room and assesses it by habit, across the parlor, across the still piano, across Callum Briggs's hand flat on the keys, across Emily. It stopped there. Emily looked at him for exactly 1 second. Then she looked back at Briggs and said clearly and without a tremor in her voice, "You can finish that sentence, Mr. Briggs, or you can take your hand off that piano. One of those options ends this evening the way you want it to. The other one doesn't." Briggs turned to see what Emily was looking at. The tall man had not moved from the door. He had not said a word. He was holding his hat in his hand now, having removed it, an automatic courtesy. The gesture of a man raised to take his hat off indoors, and he was watching Callum Briggs with an expression that was not threatening exactly. It was something quieter than threatening. It was the expression of a man who has decided something and is waiting to see if the decision needs to be acted on. Briggs looked at him. The tall man looked back. Briggs took his hand off the piano. He said something under his breath that Emily didn't catch, and moved away from the bench back toward his companions at the far end of the room. And the conversation in the parlor gradually resumed. And the moment passed, and Emily sat at the piano, with her hands in her lap, for 3 full seconds before she placed them back on the keys and began to play again. She didn't look at the man at the door, but she was aware of him the way you're aware of a window in a dark room, of the particular quality of what comes through it. She played until her hands were steady, which took a little longer than usual. His name, she would learn, was Caleb Morgan, and he hadn't come to the Silver Lantern looking for her. He hadn't come looking for anything in particular, just a cool drink and maybe a few hours out of the mountains. He didn't know her name or her story, or the number on the contract folded in Langford's coat pocket. But he had come through the door on the worst night of her 6 weeks in that house, and he had not looked away. Caleb Morgan did not come back the next day. Emily told herself she hadn't expected him to. She told herself she hadn't noticed his absence, the way you notice a sound that stops the particular quality of quiet that follows something that had been making noise without you quite registering it was there. She told herself all of that while she sat at the piano the following evening and played through her full repertoire twice and kept her eyes on the keys with a discipline that had nothing to do with musical focus. He had been a stranger who stood in a doorway for 10 minutes and then ordered a drink and sat in the corner and left before midnight. That was all. Men came through that door every night. She noticed none of them the way she'd noticed him, but that was circumstance. Timing. The fact that Briggs had been standing there with his hand on her piano at the exact moment the door opened, so that the timing of the arrival had felt like something that meant something when it probably meant nothing at all. She played through the 3rd evening and told herself this, and on the 4th evening he came back. She knew it before she saw him, which was a thing she couldn't explain then and couldn't explain later. Some shift in the room's atmosphere, the way a room shifts when someone enters it, who is fundamentally different in character from the people already in it. She felt it in the middle of a hymn and looked up from the keys, and there he was, just inside the door again, hat already in his hand, looking at the room with the same calm assessment she'd seen before. He found her immediately. His gaze moved to the piano without hesitation, as though he'd come back specifically knowing where she'd be. He gave her a single nod. Brief, not familiar, just acknowledgement. The acknowledgement of one person to another across a room. Person to person. Nothing more complicated than that. And somehow that was the most uncomplicated thing that had happened to Emily in 7 weeks. She nodded back and kept playing. He took the same corner as before, ordered a drink he nursed all evening, and spoke to no one. Langford noticed. Emily saw Langford notice the slight pause in the warm manufactured circulation when his gaze moved to the corner and held there a beat too long. She saw him calculate. The tall, quiet man in trail clothes who came 2 nights in 4 and sat in the corner and watched the room was a variable Langford had not yet categorized, and uncategorized variables bothered him. He didn't approach Caleb that night. He filed him and moved on. Emily filed the fact that Langford had filed him and moved on. At the end of the evening, when the room was clearing, Caleb stood to leave and stopped at the piano. He waited until the men nearest them had moved toward the door, and then he put his hat on the top of the piano just for a moment, and he said quietly, not performing the words for any audience, "You play real well, ma'am." "Thank you," Emily said. "That last piece, before the room cleared, what was it? Something my mother taught me." She looked at him directly for the first time in the full light of the room, and what she saw was a man, somewhere in his mid-30s, weathered in the way of men who spend the majority of their lives outside, with eyes that were a particular steady gray, and a way of holding himself that was so far from the studied authority of men like Langford that the contrast was almost disorienting. Langford's authority came from his coat and his voice and his room. This man's came from somewhere behind his sternum and apparently required no performance at all. "It's Scots-Irish, old. I know it," Caleb said. "My grandmother sang it." He picked up his hat from the piano. "Good evening, ma'am." "Good evening," Emily said. He walked out, and Rose appeared at Emily's elbow before the door had fully swung closed. "Who is that?" she breathed. "I don't know," Emily said. "Langford's been watching him all night." "I know." "That's not good, Emily." "No," Emily said. "But it might be useful." Rose stared at her. Emily began putting the piano cover down for the night methodically, one end and then the other, and she did not elaborate because she didn't have anything more solid than instinct yet, and she had learned that instinct needs time to become information before it's worth sharing. But the instinct said that man is not afraid of this room, and that meant something. She just hadn't figured out what yet. Caleb Morgan had come to Beckley for a horse. That was the plain truth of it. Unglamorous and practical, he'd been buying and selling horses in the mountain counties since he came back from the war 12 years prior and settled in the high country above the Gauley River, and a man in Beckley named Aldridge had wired him about a pair of Morgans. Good irony that he was selling off cheap because he was moving his family to Ohio. Caleb had come down from the mountain for the horse deal and intended to be in town 3 days and then go back up where the air was cleaner and the company was mostly his own. He had not intended to walk into the Silver Lantern. He had walked past it on his first night, heard the piano through the door, and gone in because he was a man who had grown up with music in the house and missed it in the years since. In the particular way you miss something that once made your mother's face go peaceful, and a woman playing piano in a room full of noise was a thing that made him stop and want to hear it better. He had not intended to come back. The thing with Briggs had unsettled him. He had stood in that doorway and seen the man's hand come down flat on the keys and seen the girl's face go still with the specific stillness of a person who has learned to control their fear rather than show it, and something old and uncomplicated in him had straightened up and paid attention. He hadn't needed to do anything. She had handled it herself cleanly, and he had been surprised by that. And something more than surprised. Something that did not have a word he could put to it easily, So he'd left it alone and gone back to his room at the boarding house, and then gone back to the Silver Lantern 2 nights later, which he hadn't planned on doing, but here he was. He wasn't a man who spent much time examining his own reasons for things. He had found in the 12 years since the war that the reasons didn't usually change the outcome. You did the thing, or you didn't. He was doing this. On his 5th evening in Beckley, the horse deal having been concluded, and his return to the mountain being something he could have done any morning that week. He arrived at the Silver Lantern to find the piano empty. He stopped. The room was running normally, drinks noise, Langford circulating, but the piano bench was vacant, and the room had a slightly different texture because of it. A gap in the sound that most people probably weren't consciously registering, but that Caleb registered immediately. He went to the bar. "The piano girl," he said to the barkeep. "She ill?" The barkeep. A young man with the particular expression of someone who has decided that not knowing is professionally safer than knowing, shrugged. Mrs. Doyle called her upstairs. Caleb picked up his drink. He sat in his corner. He waited. 20 minutes later, Emily came down the stairs. She crossed the room to the piano without making eye contact with anyone, sat down, placed her hands on the keys, and began to play. And Caleb, who had known a lot of people in his life, saw in the set of her back and the line of her jaw and the small controlled movement of her chest that something had happened upstairs that she was currently working very hard not to let anyone see on her face. She played 3 songs before her hands steadied. He noticed when they steadied. He thought probably she noticed too. At the end of the evening he went to the piano, and he waited for the space to clear the way he had before, and he said, "You all right, ma'am?" Emily looked at him. "Yes," she said. "That wasn't a courtesy question," Caleb said. Her hands stilled on the keys. She looked at him more fully, the way you look at a thing when you need to decide what it is really, what category it belongs in, whether it's safe. "Langford had a conversation with me," she said, "about my value to the establishment and how I've been spending it." Caleb said nothing. He waited. "He's decided," Emily said, keeping her voice level with visible effort, "that my time at the piano is a temporary concession and that the arrangement is going to change, starting next week." The room was noisy enough around them that no one was paying them particular attention. Caleb kept his voice low anyway. "What kind of arrangement?" "The usual kind," Emily said, "for this kind of house." The muscles in Caleb's jaw moved once. "And you don't want that?" "No," Emily said. "I very much do not want that." He looked at her. She looked back. And there it was. Not attraction, not yet something more fundamental than attraction. Something that happens when 2 people recognize in each other the same basic orientation toward the world. A refusal to lie about what they are and what they're seeing. "Is there a contract?" Caleb said. "There is." "Your name on it?" "My father's," she said. "Mine was not asked for." Something moved through Caleb's expression. "How old are you?" 19. "How long you been here?" 7 weeks. He picked up his hat from the top of the piano, turned it once in his hands. "Is there a lawyer in this town worth talking to?" Emily went very still. "Hale Simmons," she said. "Main Street. But Langford has—" "I know men like Langford," Caleb said. "They've got friends in every town. That doesn't make the law theirs." He put the hat on. "Good evening, Miss Carter." He knew her name. She hadn't told him her name. She opened her mouth and he was already moving toward the door, unhurried the same way he did everything. And she sat at the piano and put her hands back on the keys and played something she hadn't played in the Silver Lantern before, something with steel in it, something her mother used to play when she was angry and needed her hands to work it out. And she played it all the way through to the end. He knew her name, which meant he'd asked. Which meant he'd asked someone here in this town about the girl at the piano, and someone had told him, and he had come back anyway. He had come back and stood at the piano and asked her about Simmons. She did not let herself read too much into it. She had enough sense for that. A stranger asking questions and knowing a name was not rescue. It was a single data point, and she had learned the hard way what happened to girls in this house who invested hope in data points that hadn't been confirmed yet. Nettie had invested in hope. Nettie was gone, but she filed it. She filed it in the same place. She filed the crack in the piano and the crack in the contract and all the small things she'd been cataloging since the first morning, and she went to bed that night and lay with the canvas bag against her chest and breathed carefully and let herself feel for exactly 5 minutes before she shut it down the specific terrifying thing that had happened to her chest when he said that wasn't a courtesy question. 5 minutes. Then she slept. Gotcha. The next morning, Langford called her to his office. The office was at the back of the house behind the kitchen, a room Emily had been in only once when she arrived, and once when he'd discussed the piano arrangement. It smelled of cigar and paper and the particular staleness of a room where decisions get made and then filed away. Langford sat behind his desk with the ledger open and his hands folded on it, and he looked at Emily in the doorway with an expression she hadn't seen on him before. Suspicion. "The man in the corner," Langford said. "You know him." It was not a question. Emily came into the room and sat in the chair across the desk without being invited, because she had learned that small acts of self-possession in this office mattered enormously, and she said, "He's a customer who's spoken to me at the piano. He asked Pell about you." Pell. Emily kept her face neutral. "The dry goods man. Aldrich told me, the horse seller. He said a mountain man named Morgan had been asking around town. About you specifically." Langford's voice was still warm, still measured, but underneath the warmth was something that had not been there in their previous conversations, an edge. The edge of a man who has recalculated and doesn't like the new number. "I need you to understand, Miss Carter, that this establishment has a reputation to maintain. And men who come in here asking questions about my girls are men who are bad for that reputation." "I haven't spoken to him about anything but music," Emily said. "I know that," Langford said. "I also know you're smarter than most of the girls I've worked with, and I've been allowing for that because smart girls who play piano are useful to me. But smart girls who make connections outside this house that I don't control are a different matter." "What are you suggesting?" Emily said. "I'm suggesting," Langford said, leaning forward slightly, "that the next time Mr. Morgan comes to this establishment, your conversation with him is limited to the piano and nothing else. And that if he asks you anything beyond music, you tell me about it, immediately." Emily looked at him. "You want me to inform on a customer. I want you to protect your position here," Langford said. And there, it was the threat dressed as advice the way a man like Langford always dressed his threats. "Your contract is my business, Miss Carter. Any interference with that contract is interference with my business. I deal with interference firmly." "I understand," Emily said. She stood, walked to the door. And at the threshold she paused. She didn't plan it. It came from the same place as her hands not shaking. The night Briggs put them on the piano, and she turned back and said, "Mr. Langford, the piano arrangement. You said it was going to change next week." "It is." "How much time do I have?" His eyes narrowed slightly, not at the question, at the tone of a woman doing arithmetic. 5 days, he said. "Thank you," Emily said, and left. 5 days. She went upstairs, past Rose coming down with a breakfast tray, past Clara folding linen in the hallway, and into her room, and she shut the door and stood with her back against it, and thought as fast and clearly as she had thought about anything in her life. 5 days before Langford changed the arrangement. 5 days before the one thing she'd been holding between herself and the worst of it was taken off the table. 5 days, and Caleb Morgan was in this town asking questions, and she had no way to reach him, and no way to get out without being found the way Nettie had been found. And Langford had just told her he knew Morgan was asking around, which meant Langford was watching Morgan, which meant any approach Emily made to Morgan now would be seen. She needed a way to talk to him that Langford couldn't see. She needed it in the next 5 days. She needed help from inside the house. She knocked on Clara's door that afternoon. Clara opened it, took one look at Emily's face, and stepped back to let her in without a word. Emily told her. She told her all of it. Langford's conversation, Morgan, the 5 days Simmons, the lawyer. She told it fast and plain. No performance, just information. And when she finished, Clara sat on the edge of her bed for a long time without speaking. "Emily," she said finally. "I know the risk," Emily said. "I'm not asking you to do anything. I need to get a message to Morgan. I need someone who goes outside the house, the kitchen girl, the laundry. Anyone who could pass something to him at the boarding house without Langford knowing." Clara looked at her hands. "May," she said. "The kitchen girl. She goes to the market every morning before 6. Langford's driver doesn't follow her because she's not. She's just hired. She's not under contract." She paused. "But Emily, if this goes wrong—" "I know," Emily said. "If Langford finds out I helped you." Clara. Emily sat beside her on the bed. "I know. I'm asking anyway. Because you told me about the farm in West Virginia and the man you were going to marry, and you told me at 2 a.m. in the hallway, when you didn't have to tell me anything, and I think you told me because you're not done either. Are you—" Clara's jaw worked. "Are you done?" Emily said. "No," Clara said very quietly. "I'm not done." "Then help me get a message to Caleb Morgan." Clara looked up. Something moved across her face that had not been there since Emily had arrived. Something that was frightened and alive, and exactly the thing you see in someone who has decided to stop watching the door and start being the person who opens it. "Write it," she said. "Write it tonight. I'll talk to May in the morning." Emily went back to her room, and she wrote the note on the single piece of paper she had in the small, clear handwriting her mother had taught her and her teachers at the one-room school in the Hollow had refined. And she wrote, "Mr. Morgan, I have 5 days. After that, the contract terms change, and I will have no more mornings free. If what you asked at the piano was a real question, I need Hale Simmons to know my name before those 5 days are up. I cannot go to him myself. E. Carter." She folded it 4 times and held it in her hand and sat with the weight of it. If Caleb Morgan was just a man who'd been kind at a piano, this note would go nowhere, and she would have risked Clara for nothing and be no worse off than she already was, which was bad enough. If he was something else, if the question he'd asked about Simmons had been what it had felt like in the moment it was asked, then this was the thread. The single thread in the wall. The thing you pull on when you have nothing left to lose. She had exactly 5 days and nothing left to lose. She gave the note to Clara before lights out. In the morning, May went to the market. Caleb Morgan was eating breakfast at the boarding house when the kitchen girl came to the door. She handed him the folded paper without a word, with the practiced nothing expression of someone who has been told to give and not to explain, and was gone before he'd properly registered what had happened. He unfolded it at the table, read it twice, and set it down beside his coffee. He sat for a moment. He was a man who had spent 12 years making decisions that were his alone to make in a cabin above the Gauley River, where the nearest person was 4 miles down a trail that was unmaintained and largely theoretical. He had structured his life specifically so that other people's situations were not his situations. He was not cold-hearted about it. He had reasons, and the reasons were the kind that came from watching what happened when you put yourself in the middle of things. He had come back from the war knowing that some involvement is permanent, that you don't always get to decide where you go in and walk out fine the other side. He picked up the note again. 5 days. After that, the contract terms change. He knew what that meant. He had understood what that meant the night he walked through the Silver Lantern door and saw the room for what it was. And he had understood it more specifically when she'd told him about the arrangement changing. He was not naive about what kind of establishment the Silver Lantern was. He had not let himself think too clearly about what it meant for the girl at the piano, because thinking about it clearly would have required him to do something about it, and he'd still been telling himself at that point that the horse deal was done and he was going back up the mountain. He had not gone back up the mountain. He folded the note and put it in his shirt pocket and finished his coffee and put on his hat. He went to find Hale Simmons. Simmons was a thin man in his 50s, with the dry, deliberate manner of a lawyer who has practiced in small towns long enough to know that most of what he does is mediation between people who are all slightly wrong, and the satisfaction comes from the cases where someone is clearly and specifically wrong and you can do something about it. He listened to Caleb with his hands flat on his desk and his eyes on the wall above Caleb's head, the way some men listen when they're focusing hard enough that they don't need to look at you. When Caleb finished, Simmons said, "I know Langford." "I figured you might," Caleb said. "He has friends in this county." "I know." "This is not a simple matter," Simmons said. "A contract between a legal guardian and a third party. The girl is 19 years old," Caleb said. "Her father is not her legal guardian by the law of this state at 19, and the contract terms room and board debt accumulating against a minor's obligation binding services not specified at the point of signing those are terms that a circuit court judge would look at sideways." Simmons looked at him directly now. "You know the law, Mr. Morgan." "I know enough of it," Caleb said. "I had a good reason to learn it some years back." Simmons was quiet for a moment. Then he opened a drawer in his desk and pulled out a ledger of his own, smaller than Langford's older, with a spine that had been repaired twice. "Langford's operation has been in this county for 4 years," he said. "In 4 years, I have had 3 girls come to me independently about contracts they couldn't get out of. In all 3 cases, I was not able to do anything because the girls disappeared before we could file. Langford found out each time. There's a man named Briggs," Caleb said. "Rail foreman. He's a regular at the Silver Lantern, and he's had a specific problem with Miss Carter on 2 occasions. If he's the kind of man who talks about his evenings—" "He is," Simmons said flatly. "Briggs couldn't keep a secret if you nailed his mouth shut." "Then if Briggs tells Langford that a mountain man has been asking about one of his girls," Caleb said, "Langford's going to move faster than 5 days." Simmons stared at him. "You're saying we have less time than the girl thinks." "I'm saying we might." Simmons stood up. He went to a cabinet behind him and pulled out a file, and Caleb recognized the type the file a careful man keeps about a thing he's been watching and waiting for the right moment on. It was not a thin file. "I'll need to speak with her directly," Simmons said. Her account of the signing specifically, was she present?" "She was," Caleb said. "She told me she watched her father sign." "A witness to a coerced contract." Simmons pressed his lips together. "And her own signature was not on the document?" "No." "Then we have an argument," Simmons said. He said it the way a man says something he's been wanting to say for 4 years. "We have a real argument, Mr. Morgan. What we need is to get her out of that house and in front of a judge before Langford knows what's happening." "How long to file an emergency petition?" Caleb said. "If I write tonight, I can have it ready by morning. But getting it in front of Judge Carey—" "How long?" 2 days. Maybe less if I go to him personally." 2 days, Caleb said. He stood. He picked up his hat. He thought about the girl at the piano with her hands going still, and the 5-minute window of feeling she allowed herself before she shut it down. He didn't know. That's what she did. He'd only seen the outside of it, but he'd seen enough to know it for what it was. The exact controlled behavior of someone who has decided that hope is a thing to be rationed. "File tonight," he said. "Mr. Morgan." Simmons looked at him over the ledger. "If this goes to Langford before we're ready, that girl disappears, the same way the others did." "I know," Caleb said. "Can you keep Langford from knowing for 2 days?" Caleb thought about the arithmetic expression, and the warm manufactured voice, and the man who had been running his operation in this county for 4 years, with the magistrate and the commissioners in his pocket. He thought about the note folded in his shirt pocket. He thought about the ridge above Blackwater Hollow that Emily Carter had stood at the edge of and looked up at before she got into that buggy. "I can try," he said. He went back to the boarding house and he sat on the edge of the bed and he took the note out of his pocket and read it one more time. And then he put it on the nightstand and lay back with his hands behind his head and looked at the ceiling and made the decision that he knew. Even as he was making it was the kind of decision that changes the shape of everything that comes after. He was not going back up the mountain. Not yet. Not until this was finished. And downstairs in the Silver Lantern, Emily Carter sat at the piano that Thursday evening, with 4 days left on Langford's clock, though she didn't yet know the clock might be running faster than that, and she played every piece she knew. She played as well as she had ever played, precisely and clearly, and when a man at the far end of the room said something appreciative and loud about the music, she did not acknowledge it because the music was not for him. The music was for the girl in Blackwater Hollow, who had pressed her mother's Bible against her chest in the dark and said, "I am not done." She was playing to keep that girl alive inside her until something changed. She did not know yet that something already had. Simmons filed the petition that Thursday night. Caleb knew because he waited outside the lawyer's office until the lamp went dark at 11:30, and when Simmons came out pulling his coat against the summer night, he gave Caleb a single nod that said everything without saying anything. The paperwork existed. The argument was on record. The next step was Judge Carey, and Judge Carey was in Fayetteville, 18 miles east, and Simmons was going there in the morning on the first stage. 2 days, Simmons said again. 2 days, Caleb said. He walked back to the boarding house and did not sleep. He lay on the bed with his boots on and stared at the ceiling and ran the arithmetic the way he'd been running it since he sat across from Simmons that afternoon. Langford knew he'd been asking questions. Aldridge had talked the way men talk when they don't think the information matters. Langford had warned Emily to limit their conversations. Langford was watching, which meant any move Caleb made in the next 48 hours that looked like a move would bring the whole thing down before Simmons got back from Fayetteville. He had to be still. Being still was the hardest thing he knew how to do when something needed doing. He had learned it in the war, the specific discipline of waiting when every instinct said move, and he had never fully made his peace with it. But he lay on the bed, and he was still, and he thought about the note in his shirt pocket and the girl who had written it with 5 days on her clock and steady handwriting and not one word of self-pity in the entire message. He had known a lot of people in his life. He had known very few who could be that precise under that kind of pressure. In the morning, he went to the livery where his horses were boarded, and he checked on them and talked to the livery man about nothing in particular. Trail conditions, summer heat. The creek levels up on the Gauley, and he was easy and unhurried about it. A mountain man with no particular schedule who had concluded his horse business and was in no rush to get back to the high country. He ate breakfast at the boarding house table with the other lodgers and talked about the weather. He walked the main street in the mid-morning and bought tobacco he didn't need from a shop near Simmons's office and noted that Simmons's door was locked, stage already gone. Good. At noon, going back past the dry goods store, he saw Langford's driver, the clean-vested man from the buggy, standing at the corner of the main street and the side street where the Silver Lantern sat. Standing there doing nothing in particular, which was its own kind of particular. Watching the street, watching who went where. Caleb walked past without slowing. He didn't look at the driver. He went back to the boarding house and sat in the front room with a newspaper he read 3 times without taking in a word of it. The driver had not been there yesterday morning. Langford had moved his clock up. Caleb put the newspaper down and thought. He thought hard and fast the way you think when the situation has changed and the plan needs to change with it. If Langford's driver was on the street watching, then Langford was no longer in the comfortable surveillance phase he was in, the active response phase. Something had shifted his timeline. Either Briggs had talked, which was always a possibility, or someone inside the house had been less discreet than they needed to be, or Langford had simply done the arithmetic on a mountain man who kept coming back to listen to a specific girl play piano and concluded that arithmetic didn't add up to innocent. Caleb had 48 hours. He might now have 24. He needed to get a message to Emily without going anywhere near the Silver Lantern. He needed Clara. He didn't know Clara. He knew the name from what Emily had told him in their brief exchanges at the piano, the girl who'd been there longest, the one Emily had recruited. He had no way to reach her that didn't go through the front door of the Silver Lantern, or through May the kitchen girl, and May's market run was in the morning, which was 16 hours away. He sat with that for 10 minutes. Then he went to find May himself. It took him an hour, 3 careful questions asked at careful distance from the Silver Lantern, and some patience. May lived in a rooming house 2 streets over, a young woman of perhaps 20, with the wariness of someone who has learned that involvement in other people's situations tends to cost the person with the least power, which was always her. She looked at Caleb in the hallway of her rooming house with her arms crossed and said flat and direct, "I already gave her the message you sent." "I know," Caleb said. "I need you to take another one. Tonight, not morning." "I don't go to the Silver Lantern at night," May said. "My arrangement with Mrs. Doyle is kitchen work mornings only. I go there at night, someone's going to ask why." "Not to the Silver Lantern," Caleb said. "Is there a way to reach Clara, the girl who's been there longest, without going through the front?" May looked at him for a long time. She was doing the same thing Emily did. He realized running the arithmetic of risk against the arithmetic of what happened if she didn't. "There's a back kitchen door," she said, "but Doyle locks it by 8. "It's 6:30 now," Caleb said. May made a sound that was not quite a sigh and not quite a decision, but was the sound between those two things. "Write it," she said. "I'll go now before it locks." He wrote it on the back of the newspaper margin 4 lines. He kept it plain. Langford's moving faster. Driver on the street today. Simmons is in Fayetteville, back tomorrow evening or morning after. You need to be ready to leave the moment I come to that door. Tell Clara thank you. C. Morgan. May took it. She went. Caleb went back to the boarding house and put his saddlebags in order and his horses ready at the livery, told in advance and paid extra to have them saddled and available on short notice day or night. He checked his rifle. He checked the legal document. Simmons had left him a copy of the petition signed and stamped, which Simmons had pressed into his hands the night before, saying, "If something happens before I get back, you show them this. It's not an order, but it's a filed document, and any official worth his office will recognize it." He folded the copy inside his vest against his chest. Then he sat down to wait again, which was the hardest thing he knew how to do, and he did it. Emily got the message at 20 minutes to 8. Clara brought it upstairs between the kitchen and the parlor opening, slipping it into Emily's hand in the hallway with a grip that held a second longer than necessary. Not hesitation, a squeeze. A small, deliberate human contact that said, "I see this. I'm in this with you." Emily pressed Clara's hand back and went to her room and read the note twice and then tore it into pieces small enough that no configuration of them would reassemble into anything legible, and she dropped the pieces in the washing water and watched them dissolve. Langford's driver on the street. She had seen him too at noon through the parlor window. She had not known that's what it meant. She did now. She sat on the bed and let herself feel the fear for exactly 3 minutes full and undiluted. The real thing, not the managed version she showed the world. And then she packed the canvas bag. She packed it exactly as she had packed it in Blackwater Hollow. The wooden box with Thomas's hair. The photograph, the Bible, the second dress, the wool blanket. Everything that was hers. Everything that could not be left behind. She put the bag under the mattress. She put her face into order. She went downstairs and sat at the piano and played. Langford came to stand near the piano at 9 o'clock, which he did sometimes, the proprietary circulation of a man reviewing his inventory. He stood with his drink and listened for a minute and said pleasantly, "You're in good form tonight, Miss Carter." "Thank you, Mr. Langford. I've been thinking," he said conversationally, "about our arrangement. I believe I was perhaps hasty saying 5 days. I think we can be flexible about the timeline." Emily kept playing. She felt the shift in the air the way you feel weather coming, the change in pressure before the storm is visible. He was being flexible because he'd decided she was a flight risk, and he wanted her calm. He was managing her. "I appreciate that," she said. "Good." He sipped his drink. "And the mountain man, Mr. Morgan, has he been in tonight?" "Not tonight," Emily said, which was true. Langford looked at the room. "I understand he concluded his horse business earlier this week. He should be heading back to his mountains soon, I'd think." "I wouldn't know," Emily said. "No," Langford said. "I don't suppose you would." He moved on smooth and warm, and Emily played through the next song without missing a note, and did not let her hands shake. He knew. He didn't know what he knew, but he knew enough. The flexibility about the timeline was not generosity. It was a cage door being closed more quietly than originally planned. He was going to move her. Not in 5 days, not in 4. He was going to move her soon to somewhere Caleb Morgan and Hale Simmons couldn't reach her, and he was going to do it in a way that looked like nothing in particular to the people watching. She needed Simmons back tonight. She did not have Simmons back tonight. She had tomorrow, maybe tomorrow night, maybe the morning after, and she had one instruction: be ready to leave the moment I come to that door. She played until midnight with the canvas bag under the mattress upstairs, and Langford's driver somewhere on the street outside, and the specific terror of a person who can see the wall closing in, and has done everything they can do, and is now entirely dependent on whether someone they met 2 weeks ago at a piano is the person they believed him to be. She was not good at dependence. She had never had the luxury of it. But she had written that note and put it in Clara's hands, and she had meant every word of it, and now the only thing left was to wait, and waiting was its own kind of courage. She went to bed at midnight. She did not sleep. Simmons came back from Fayetteville at 2 in the afternoon the following day. Caleb was at the stage stop when the coach rolled in, which he'd been for the past hour, because he had nothing to do that was more important than being there the moment Simmons stepped off. The lawyer came down the stage steps with his bag in one hand and a leather folder in the other, and he looked at Caleb and said without preamble, "Judge Carey signed it." Caleb felt something release in his chest. When? This morning. Emergency writ of examination. It compels Langford to produce the contract and the girl before the court within 24 hours of service. Simmons held up the leather folder. I also have a letter from Carey to the county sheriff authorizing him to accompany service of the writ. Langford cannot refuse it without being in contempt. The sheriff, Caleb said. Is he Langford's? Partly, Simmons said. He's also a man who's been sheriff for 14 years and knows what a circuit court judge's signature looks like, and what happens to sheriffs who ignore circuit court judges. Simmons almost smiled. It was the smile of a man who has been waiting 4 years for a specific piece of paper to exist. He'll do his job. We need to serve it today, Caleb said. Langford's driver has been on the street since yesterday. He's getting ready to move her. Simmons looked at him sharply. How do you know? I don't for certain. I know a man like Langford doesn't put his driver on the street for decoration. We go now, Simmons said. He didn't put his bag down. He turned toward the sheriff's office with the leather folder under his arm, and his coat still dusty from the stage, and Caleb fell into step beside him, and they walked the main street of Beckley in the July afternoon heat with the kind of deliberate pace that is different from hurrying in the same way that purpose is different from panic. The sheriff's name was Cole. He was a wide, solid man in his late 50s with a gray mustache and the particular brand of political practicality that comes from holding elected office in a county where powerful men have opinions. He read the writ twice. He read the letter from Judge Carey once. He set them both on his desk and put his hands flat on either side of them and looked at Simmons. Langford's going to say the contract's legitimate, Cole said. The contract may be legitimate, Simmons said. The writ doesn't invalidate the contract. It compels the court to examine whether the contract was executed legally and whether the services described constitute legal indenture under state law. That is a judge's question, not yours. If I walk into the Silver Lantern with this paper, you'll be doing your job, Simmons said, which is what 14 years in office means people expect you to do. Cole looked at the writ for another moment. Then he stood and got his hat. I'll want 2 deputies, he said. Bring them, Caleb said. Cole looked at him. You're the mountain man. Caleb Morgan. You got a stake in this, Mr. Morgan. Caleb thought about how to answer that. He thought about the note on the nightstand and the girl who had written it with her hand steady. I've found an injustice, he said. I don't need a stake beyond that. Cole studied him for a moment, with the evaluating look of a man who has spent 14 years reading people for a living. Then he nodded. All right, he said. Let's go. They went to the Silver Lantern at 3:30 in the afternoon, which was the dead hour too late for lunch, too early for evening, when the house was quietest and Langford was most likely to be in his office doing accounts. Cole and his 2 deputies went to the front door. Caleb went around to the back alley to the kitchen door because Simmons had said that the writ compelled production of the girl as well as the contract, and Caleb had no intention of standing in the front parlor while Emily Carter was moved out the back before she knew what was happening. He knocked on the kitchen door. A long pause. Then it opened, and Clara stood in the doorway with her eyes wide and her jaw set, and her hands gripping the doorframe. And before Caleb could say a word, she said, "She's upstairs, second door on the left. But Langford's driver came in 20 minutes ago, and he's been talking to Doyle in the kitchen, and I think—" "Where's the driver now?" Caleb said. "I don't know. He went toward the back stairs." Caleb went through the kitchen door. Clara stepped back to let him through without hesitation, which was its own kind of courage, and he moved through the kitchen fast and quiet and took the back stairs two at a time. And at the top of the stairs, he heard it, the driver's voice, and Doyle's, and the sound of a door. He turned the corner. The driver had Emily's arm above the elbow, and Emily had the canvas bag over her other shoulder, and her heels dug into the hallway floor, and she was not screaming. She was doing the thing she apparently always did, which was go very still and very deliberate, and she was saying in the flat, precise voice Caleb had heard her use with Briggs, "Take your hand off my arm." "Mrs. Doyle says you're being moved, miss," the driver said. "Mr. Langford's orders. It's not—" "Take your hand off her arm," Caleb said. The driver turned. He was a big man, bigger than he'd looked from the buggy seat, with the build of someone who'd been hired for more than driving. He looked at Caleb in the hallway, with the professional assessment of a man calculating a confrontation, and Caleb stood at the top of the back stairs with his hands loose at his sides, and looked back with the expression that had made Callum Briggs take his hand off Emily's piano. It was not a threatening expression. That was the thing about it. It was something quieter than threatening. It was the expression of a man who has made a decision and is waiting to find out if action is required. The driver let go of Emily's arm. "There is a sheriff in your front parlor right now," Caleb said, with a signed writ from Judge Carey of the Circuit Court. "You want to take this further, you're welcome to go downstairs and have that conversation with Sheriff Cole." He paused. "Or you can step back." The driver stepped back. Emily moved. She came straight to Caleb's side with the canvas bag against her chest, and she did not run. She walked the steady, slightly uneven walk of a woman who has never let her bad leg make her hurry in a way that looked like fear, and she went past Caleb and down the back stairs without looking at the driver again. Caleb followed. In the front of the house they could hear it. Langford's voice, the warm, manufactured warmth entirely stripped away, now replaced with something that was its true self underneath controlled fury. And Cole's voice, flat and official reading from the writ in the particular monotone of a man who is letting the paper do the work so no one can accuse him of editorializing. They came through the kitchen and out into the back alley and around to the front of the house, and when they came through the front door, Emily and Caleb came in from one side, and Cole and his deputies were standing in the parlor, with Langford, and Simmons was beside Cole with the leather folder open, and for one moment everyone in the room was still. Langford saw Emily. Then he saw Caleb beside her. The arithmetic expression moved through several calculations very fast, and what came out the other side of all of them was not rage, it was colder than rage. The expression of a man who has just understood that the board has been reset without his knowledge. "Miss Carter," he said with the last of the warmth, "I think there's been a misunderstanding." "Mr. Langford," Cole said, "the writ requires you to produce the contract. Now, sir." "The contract is entirely legal. Then producing it should be no difficulty," Simmons said. "Please do so." The room held. Langford looked at Emily one more time. Whatever he was looking for in her face, fear, uncertainty. The girl who had arrived in his buggy 8 weeks ago, still soft enough to be managed, he did not find it. She stood beside Caleb Morgan, with her canvas bag and her bad leg, and her 19 years of living on very little, and she looked at Victor Langford with the same expression she'd worn the morning she watched her father sign his name to a piece of paper in a shaking hand. Watching, fully present, not done. Langford went to his office and came back with the contract, and he laid it on the parlor table, and Simmons picked it up and read it with the careful speed of a man who knows exactly what he's looking for. And within 2 minutes, Simmons looked up and said, The signatory is listed as Thomas Henry Carter, father. Miss Carter's name does not appear as a consenting party. Her age at time of signing is listed as 19. He looked at Cole. Under state law, a 19-year-old woman is not subject to parental contract authority. This document does not have the legal force Mr. Langford has been asserting. That is a matter for the court to decide, Langford said tightly. It is, Cole said, which is why you'll be appearing before Judge Carey in Fayetteville in 24 hours. He nodded to his deputy. Take the contract as evidence. The deputy took the contract. Langford went very still. Not the stillness of defeat, the stillness of a man regrouping. Miss Carter owes this establishment for room and board accrued over 8 weeks, he said. Whatever the court decides about the contract, that debt is real. We will address the debt, Simmons said. In court, before a judge, with proper accounting reviewed by the court, not by the party who has been running the ledger. Langford looked at Caleb. You've made an enemy today, Mr. Morgan. I've made a few, Caleb said. I'm still here. Cole cleared his throat. Miss Carter, he said, you're free to leave the premises while this matter is before the court. You'll need to be available for the court examination. I will be, Emily said. Her voice was clear, completely clear. No shake in it at all, which Caleb thought was one of the more remarkable things he'd seen in a long time. She walked out of the Silver Lantern under her own power with her canvas bag on her shoulder, and Caleb one step behind her, and the Beckley afternoon heat hit her like a wall as she came through the door, and she stopped on the step and stood in the July sunlight for a moment with her eyes closed and her face turned up, and she breathed. Just breathed. Caleb stood beside her and led her. After a moment she opened her eyes. She looked at him. Her expression had finally done what he'd suspected it had been waiting 8 weeks to do, cracked open, not in grief, but in something that came after grief, something that was the beginning of whatever comes after the worst is over. Her eyes were bright with it, and she was holding it in with everything she had, and he could see exactly how much effort that was taking, which was enormous. You came to the door, she said. I told you I would, he said. Which was not precisely what he'd said in the note he'd said be ready when I come, but the meaning was close enough. She nodded once, pressed her free hand flat against her sternum over the thing beating hard underneath and exhaled. There's still the court, she said. Fayetteville. Tomorrow. Simmons is a good lawyer, Caleb said. Langford has the commissioners. He has 2 commissioners, Caleb said. He doesn't have Judge Carey. He picked up his hat, which he'd been holding since they came out of the house, and settled it back on. And he doesn't have the contract anymore. Emily looked at the street. She looked at the people moving past the ordinary afternoon business of a town that had no idea what had just happened in the Silver Lantern's parlor. She looked at the mountains visible above the rooflines, the blue July ridges going on and on to the north, and her expression did something complicated and private that was not for Caleb to interpret. Where do I go? She said. Tonight. Mrs. Aldridge keeps a respectable boarding house on the north end, Caleb said. I'll take you there. Simmons will want to talk to you this evening before tomorrow. Clara, Emily said. She turned back toward the Silver Lantern door. And rose. I can't just... One thing at a time, Miss Carter, Caleb said quietly. First you. Then we see what can be done for the others. She looked at him. The particular look of someone who has been carrying everything alone for long enough that being told one thing at a time, instead of all things right now, is almost too much to absorb. One thing at a time, she repeated. Yes, ma'am. She shifted the canvas bag on her shoulder and looked at the mountain ridges one more time, and then she straightened her back and said, All right, Mr. Morgan, show me where we're going. He fell into step beside her, and they walked north on the main street of Beckley in the July heat, and she kept pace with him steady and even, her bad leg making its familiar mark on the dust, and he matched his stride to hers, without thinking about it, and without remarking on it, the way you match someone's pace when you've decided you're walking together. Behind them, the Silver Lantern sat quiet in the afternoon sun, but inside it, something had shifted that would not shift back. Langford stood at his parlor window and watched them go, and for the first time in 4 years in this county, the arithmetic in his expression did not resolve into certainty. It resolved into something else, into the specific unsettled feeling of a man who has for the first time been outmaneuvered by people with less power and more nerve than he had calculated for. And upstairs in a small room at the end of the hall, Clara sat on the edge of a bed that was not hers and held the note Caleb had written. The torn pieces carefully reassembled on the coverlet puzzle pieced back together with the patience of a woman who has had a long time to learn patience. And she read the last line one more time. Tell Clara, thank you. She pressed the pieces flat with both palms, and she sat very still, and something that had been locked up in her chest for a very long time did something unfamiliar and frightening and necessary. It moved. Simmons came to the Aldridge boarding house at 6 that evening with his leather folder and a cup of coffee he'd clearly been carrying for so long it had gone cold, and he sat across from Emily at the kitchen table and laid out what tomorrow would look like. Judge Carey was a circuit man. He rode the territory 4 times a year, and he had seen enough of what men like Langford built in the gaps between court dates to have strong opinions about it. That was the good news. The complicated news was that Langford would appear with his own lawyer, a man named Pratt out of Charleston, who had made a career of making contracts look cleaner than they were. And Pratt was good at his job in the specific way that men who defend the indefensible have to be good not by winning arguments, but by burying them in procedure until the other side ran out of time or money or nerve. He'll argue the debt, Simmons said. Room and board for 8 weeks plus the initial $2. He'll have a ledger that makes the number look significant. How significant? Emily said. Probably somewhere between $70 and $100 the way Langford runs his accounting. Emily looked at the table. $70 was more money than she had ever seen at one time in her life. It was more money than her father had earned in a good year at the mine. It was a number designed specifically to be impossible, and everyone in the room knew it was designed that way. I don't have $70, she said. No, Simmons said. But the court isn't going to award Langford $70 either once I show the judge how his ledger works. Inflated pricing on room and board interest applied to an initial payment that was not consented to by the contracting party fees for services that were never specified in the original document. He opened the folder and laid out 3 sheets of paper covered in his careful handwriting. The real number, what a legitimate boarding house would charge for 8 weeks. Nothing more is closer to $12. Maybe $14. I don't have $12 either, Emily said. Simmons glanced at Caleb, who was sitting at the end of the table with his coffee and his hat on his knee, and had not said anything since Simmons arrived. I'll cover it, Caleb said. Emily looked at him. No. Miss Carter, no, she said again, not unkindly. Firmly the way she said things when she meant them fully, and didn't want to have to say them again. I am not going to walk out of a situation where one man paid money for me by having another man pay money for me. That's not... She stopped, pressed her lips together. That is not how I intend to start whatever comes next. Caleb looked at her for a moment. Then he nodded once slowly, the nod of a man who has just received information he respects, even when it complicates the situation. All right, he said. How do you want to handle it? What are my options? Emily said to Simmons. Simmons considered. You could petition the court to defer any monetary settlement pending your ability to pay. Carey might grant that he's not an unreasonable man. It would mean you'd owe the amount, but not immediately, and it would give you time to... I can work, Emily said. I can play piano. I can teach music. I can take in mending, washing, whatever there is. I have been keeping myself and my father alive for 3 years on almost nothing, Mr. Simmons. I can earn $14. It might take some time, Simmons said carefully. I have time, Emily said. That is precisely what tomorrow is supposed to give me back. Simmons looked at her with the expression that kept appearing on men's faces when Emily Carter said something they hadn't expected. Not surprise exactly. More like the recalibration of an estimate. All right, he said. I'll argue for deferred settlement. Carey may grant it. He gathered his papers. We leave for Fayetteville at 7 in the morning. It's 18 miles. The hearing is at noon. He left. The kitchen went quiet. Emily sat with her hands around her own coffee cup, not drinking it, just holding the warmth, and Caleb sat at the other end of the table, giving her the particular kind of space that is not distance, but is the recognition that some moments need room around them. After a while, she said, "You didn't agree with me. About the money." "Didn't say that," Caleb said. "You thought it would be simpler." "Simpler, yes," he said. "Right is a different question, and you'd already answered the right question before I got to it." She looked at him. "You do that?" she said. "Do what?" "Wait until I've said the thing, and then agree with it. Like you already knew what I was going to say." Caleb turned his hat over once in his hands. "I don't know what you're going to say," he said. "I just figure you usually know what you mean, and it's worth waiting to hear it." The quiet that followed that was a different quality of quiet than the ones that had come before it in this conversation. Emily felt it, and she thought she understood what it was, and she thought she was probably not wrong about what it was, and she also thought that this was not the moment for it, not the night before a court hearing, not 8 weeks into what had been the worst 2 months of her life, not with tomorrow still between her and whatever came after. "I should sleep," she said. "Yes, ma'am," Caleb said. He stood put on his hat. "I'll be here at 6:30. He left, and she went upstairs to the room Mrs. Aldridge had given her clean, small, with a window that looked north toward the mountains, and she unpacked the canvas bag for the first time since Blackwater Hollow. She set the wooden box on the nightstand. She set the photograph of her parents beside it. She laid the Bible on the bed and opened it to the pressed wildflowers and psalms, and she sat there in the quiet and looked at them for a long time. "Tomorrow, Mama," she said. "Tomorrow I go and say what I have to say." The wildflowers didn't answer, but holding them, she felt something she hadn't felt in 8 weeks, the specific feeling of being, however temporarily and however tentatively, in a place she had chosen, even this narrow room, even this borrowed bed. She had walked to it under her own power. No contract governed it. No man's ledger tracked her hours in it. She slept. For the first time in 8 weeks, she slept all the way through. The stage to Fayetteville left at 7, and by 6:50, Emily and Caleb and Simmons were at the stage stop, and by 6:55, Victor Langford's black buggy had rolled to a stop on the opposite side of the street. Langford did not get out. He sat inside with the curtain partly open and watched them, and beside him in the buggy was a man Emily didn't know. Lean dressed better than anyone in Beckley had any right to be, with the kind of careful stillness that meant he was doing the same thing Emily was doing, which was watching and cataloging. "Pratt," Simmons said without looking. "He knows not to approach us before the hearing. It would be improper." He paused. "He'll try everything else." "What's everything else?" Caleb said. "He'll argue the contract was a legitimate labor agreement, and that Miss Carter's participation in the Silver Lantern's operations, even the piano playing, constitutes acceptance of its terms. He'll argue that moral objections are not legal objections. He'll argue that Henry Carter's legal authority as a parent extends past the age of majority in cases of financial dependency." Simmons adjusted his folder under his arm. "He'll be wrong on all 3 counts, but he'll be wrong elegantly, and that's what Carrie will have to navigate." The stage arrived. They boarded. The Langford buggy moved when they moved, staying at a distance that was not close enough to be harassment and not far enough to be coincidental. Emily sat across from Simmons and beside the window and watched the Virginia mountains pass. She had made this road twice now, coming and going to the court, and she was aware of the specific symmetry of it, the way the same landscape can look entirely different depending on which direction you're carrying yourself through it. Coming in, she had been watching for exits cataloging surviving. Going to Fayetteville, she was going to speak. She was going to say what she had to say in front of a judge, and what she said was going to matter, and she was going to say it clearly. "Tell me," she said to Simmons, "what he's going to ask me." Simmons looked up from his papers. "Carrie." "Pratt," she said. Simmons studied her. "He's going to ask whether you were aware of the nature of the Silver Lantern before you arrived. He's going to ask whether you were treated with physical violence, because without physical violence, the coercion argument is harder. He's going to ask whether you attempted to leave and were prevented." He paused. "The Nettie situation, the girl who disappeared, I cannot use that without her testimony, and I don't have it." "I know," Emily said. "He may ask about Briggs." "Let him," Emily said. Caleb across the carriage looked at her. She didn't look back. She was looking out the window at the ridgelines and running through the questions in her mind, preparing answers the way you prepare for anything, not by scripting them, but by knowing what's true and trusting yourself to say it when asked. She knew what was true. She had been in the room when it happened. She had watched her father's hand shake. She had seen Langford's driver on the street. She had sat in a parlor for 8 weeks, managing men's eyes and hands and assumptions, with a piano bench between herself and the worst of it. And she had not broken. And she was going to walk into that courtroom and say so in plain English, and let Judge Carey do what judges were supposed to do. The stage pulled into Fayetteville at 11:30. The courthouse was a 2-story building on the main square, and it smelled of wood and paper and the specific gravity of accumulated decisions. Judge Carey was a broad man in his 60s with white hair and the impatient efficiency of someone who has been dispensing justice in 4 counties for 30 years and does not enjoy having his time wasted by contracts that should never have been filed. He called the hearing to order at noon exactly. Pratt stood on Langford's side, smooth composed, with a voice like water running over rock. The kind of voice trained to sound reasonable, even when the thing it was saying was not. He laid out the argument efficiently. A legitimate labor contract, a consenting guardian, a girl who had resided in the establishment for 8 weeks without formal complaint to any authority, accrued debts under the terms of the agreement. Simmons laid out the counter, a woman past the age of majority, whose consent was never sought, a document executed under financial duress by a guardian with no legal authority to contract her labor, and an accounting inflated to create an inescapable debt structure. Carey listened to both. He asked 3 questions of Simmons. He asked 4 of Pratt. Then he looked at Emily. "Miss Carter," he said, "I'd like to hear from you directly." Emily stood. She had not rehearsed this. She had thought about it, prepared for the questions, but she had not written a speech, because speeches required you to remember them, and remembering required energy she'd been spending on other things. She spoke plainly, the way her mother had taught her to speak, directly, without ornamentation, with the expectation that the truth was sufficient and didn't need dressing up. She described the morning her father told her about Langford. She described Langford's arrival, the $2 on the table, the contract she was not asked to sign. She described the buggy ride and the silver lantern and Margaret Doyle, and the 8 weeks including the piano and Briggs and Langford's conversation about changing the arrangement. She described the driver on the street and the note she had sent and what Caleb Morgan had done. She said all of it in about 12 minutes, and she did not cry, and she did not editorialize, and she did not look at Langford once. When she finished, Carey looked at Pratt. "Counselor, the signatory to this contract." "Henry Carter, the father acting as—" "The girl is 19, Carey said. "A 19-year-old woman in the state of Virginia is not subject to her father's contractual authority. You know that." "The dependency argument." "The dependency argument requires the dependent to be incapacitated or a minor," Carey said. "Neither applies." He looked at the contract in front of him. "Furthermore, the services described in this contract are listed as hospitality and companionship, which is deliberately vague in a way that I find concerning." He set the contract down. "Mr. Pratt, what is the silver lantern?" Pratt's composure held, but something behind it shifted the way a wall shifts when the foundation moves. "A social establishment. I know what it is," Carey said flatly. "I've been riding this circuit for 30 years. I know every establishment in 4 counties. He looked at Langford directly. Langford met his gaze with the arithmetic expression, fully engaged, calculating whether there was still a position to hold. Carey's face told him clearly that there was not. "Mr. Langford, the contract is voided on grounds of lack of consenting signatory. The debt claim—" He looked at Simmons. "What's the legitimate amount?" $12.40, Simmons said. "Based on standard boarding house rates for the county." "Deferred payment," Carey said. "Miss Carter, you have 60 days to settle the legitimate boarding and meal cost of $12.40 paid to the court's account, not to Mr. Langford's." He looked back at Langford. "The balance of the claimed debt is dismissed. The contract is void and is to be surrendered to the court as evidence." He picked up his pen. "And Mr. Langford, I am going to be very clear with you. I am sending a letter to the county commissioners this week about the operation of the Silver Lantern and specifically about its contracting practices. If I see another document like this one on my bench, I will not be as contained in my response as I am being today. Do I make myself understood?" Langford said very quietly. "Yes, Your Honor." "We're adjourned," Carey said. The gavel came down. Emily stood in the middle of the courtroom, and the sound of the gavel went through her like a bell struck clean. Simmons was gathering papers, and Pratt was already leaning toward Langford with something to say, and the bailiff was opening the side door. And none of it was quite real yet. The way nothing is quite real in the first seconds after the thing you have been fighting toward arrives and is suddenly actually here. Caleb was beside her. She hadn't seen him stand. He was just there the way he'd been there at the top of the back stairs and in the parlor doorway, and on the Beckley Street present without announcement, solid, without performance. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. Emily picked up her canvas bag from the floor beside her chair. She walked out of the courtroom. They stood on the courthouse steps in the Fayetteville afternoon, and Simmons shook Emily's hand and said he'd file the court's copy of the ruling and she would have a record of it. A legal document saying the contract was void and she was a free woman with a $12 debt to settle in 60 days and nothing else owed to anyone. He shook Caleb's hand. He said, "4 years I've been waiting for a case like this to come together. It doesn't always." He looked at Emily. "You did the hard part, Miss Carter. You held on long enough for it to matter." He left to find the stage back to Beckley. Langford's buggy was in the courthouse square, and Langford was climbing into it, and Pratt was beside him saying something in a low voice, and Langford looked across the square at Emily once before the buggy door closed. It was a long look, not a warm one, but there was something in it she hadn't expected, not defeat exactly, something more reluctant than defeat. The look of a man who has been reminded that the world contains variables he cannot always control, and who has filed that reminder in the same place he files everything else to be accounted for. The buggy moved. Emily watched it go. "He'll find another way," she said. It was not a question. "Probably," Caleb said. "Men like that usually do, but it won't be you." He paused. "And Carey's letter to the commissioners is going to make the next few months uncomfortable for him regardless." "Clara," Emily said. "And Rose." "I know. They're still in there. I know that too." He turned his hat in his hands, the gesture she had come to recognize as the physical form of him choosing his words carefully. "Simmons says there may be grounds for additional challenges if the other girls are willing to come forward. It would take time. It would take them being willing to speak." "Clara's willing," Emily said. "She's been willing for a long time. She just didn't have anyone to speak to." She looked at him. "Will Simmons?" "I already asked him," Caleb said. "Before the hearing. He said yes." Emily was quiet for a moment. The specific kind of quiet that happens when you have been carrying something very heavy for a very long time, and someone has just without being asked picked up part of it. She was not sure she knew how to respond to that. She had not had a great deal of practice with it. "You keep doing that," she said. "Doing what?" "Asking the next question before I know I have it." Caleb looked at her with the steady gray eyes that she had catalogued the first evening in the Silver Lantern parlor as the eyes of a man who required no performance to have authority, and he said, "I reckon I've been thinking ahead a little." "About what?" she said. He was quiet for a moment. A mountain man's pause, not hesitation, but the pause of someone for whom words are tools, and tools should be selected carefully. "About what you do next," he said. "Where you go. Whether you've got somewhere to go." "I don't," Emily said. "I can't go back to the Hollow." She said it plainly without grief, the way you state a geographical fact. My father is there, and I don't know what I feel about my father right now, and I suspect I won't know for some time. But I can't live in that cabin and pretend the kitchen table conversation didn't happen. No, Caleb said. And I have $12 to settle in 60 days, which means I need work, and I need it somewhere I can find it. She looked down the Fayetteville street, the ordinary August afternoon of a town going about its business around two people standing on courthouse steps with the rest of their lives still to be arranged. I can play piano. I can teach it. I can take in washing or mending. I am not someone who requires saving Mr. Morgan. I want to be clear about that. You are very clear about that, Caleb said. You've been clear about that since the first night. Then why are you still here? She said. Not unkindly. As the real question it was. He looked at her. He looked at her the way he'd looked at her across the Silver Lantern parlor, the first night the assessment of a calm man who has decided something and is waiting to find out if action is required, except this time the decision was different, and the action it was waiting on was gentler. Because I'd like to keep being here, he said, if that's all right. The afternoon was very still. Emily looked at him for a long moment, and she thought about the ridge above Blackwater Hollow, and she thought about the morning she had pressed her mother's Bible to her chest in a strange room and said, I am not done. And she thought about what it meant, what it really meant to be standing on these steps in the Fayetteville sun, with a voided contract and $12 of legitimate debt, and a man who had walked through a door on the worst night and stayed because he wanted to stay. She thought about what her mother would have said. Eleanor Carter would have said, look at his hands. A man's hands tell you what he does with his days and what he thinks is worth doing. Caleb Morgan's hands were calloused from the mountains, and they had been steady at the top of the back stairs and loose at his sides in every confrontation, and they had never once reached for her without her invitation. You live up on the Gauley, Emily said. That's 4 miles from the nearest person. Give or take, he said. That's a long way from anywhere I could teach piano or take in washing. Grady's Crossing is 12 miles down from my place, Caleb said. Bigger town than the one you grew up next to. They've got a church that's been looking for someone to play Sundays. I know because the preacher asked me last winter, and I told him I don't play. A pause. You do. Emily looked at him. Something shifted in her face, not the careful, managed expression she'd worn for 8 weeks. Not the controlled stillness she'd worn for years before that in the hollow. But something underneath all of it that was younger than she'd let herself be in a very long time. Something that was not quite a smile yet, but was the thing that happens in the muscles just before a smile arrives. You've been thinking ahead, she said. He said. The church wouldn't be enough to cover $12 in 60 days, she said. There's also a schoolhouse that needs a teacher, he said. For the fall term. And Grady's Crossing has enough families that mending and washing would be steady work. You've been thinking ahead quite a lot, she said. I had some extra time, he said. Not sleeping. The almost smile became the actual smile. It arrived slowly like a thing that had been kept in the dark for 8 weeks and needed a moment to remember how light worked. But when it came, it was complete, genuine, and unmanaged, and entirely Emily Carter's own, not performed for any room or any man. Just the plain, undefended expression of a girl who had been told she was worth $2 and had declined to agree. It transformed her face the way the right chord transforms a hymn. Caleb looked at it and looked away at the street and turned his hat over once in his hands with the particular deliberateness of a man managing his own expression. I'm not asking you to do anything you don't want to do, he said, or go anywhere you haven't chosen. I know, she said. I'm asking if you'd consider. I'd consider, she said. He looked back at her. Just like that. You were at the top of those stairs, she said. Before that, you were at the piano. Before that, you were at the door. She adjusted the canvas bag on her shoulder. A man who shows up 3 times isn't asking a small thing of himself. I'd consider the same. The afternoon held them both for a moment, the courthouse square, the August heat, the mountains visible to the north in the long blue haze of a Virginia summer. And Caleb Morgan looked at Emily Carter on the courthouse steps and said very simply, "Then let's figure out what comes next." She held out her hand. He shook it, the handshake of two people agreeing to something real, not a formality but a beginning, and held it a beat past the shake and let go. They walked off the courthouse steps together into the Fayetteville afternoon, and she matched his stride, and he matched hers, and neither of them said anything for a while, because some things don't need words to be established. 3 weeks later, on the first Sunday of September, Emily Carter played the morning service at Grady's Crossing Methodist Church for the first time. She had been in the mountain town for 2 weeks, boarding with the widow Hester McGee, who had a room and was grateful for the mending Emily did in the evenings. She had signed the school teaching contract the week before 14 weeks fall term enough to cover her court debt with some remaining. The church had been told she was available and had sent the deacon to ask her formally, and she had said yes and named a fair rate, and the deacon had agreed without negotiating, which she took as a sign that the preacher had wanted her specifically. She knew who had said her name to the preacher. She had not mentioned it to Caleb when he came to Grady's Crossing that week to bring the firewood he'd promised to Hester McGee and to eat supper at the widow's table with the carefully arranged casualness of a man who has had to practice being anywhere near other people and is still learning how to do it without it looking like effort. She had not mentioned it because she didn't need to. He knew she knew. They had arrived at a kind of understanding that did not require constant narration, the way the best understandings never do. On that first Sunday, she sat at the church's upright piano, older than the silver lanterns, better tuned, with years of honest use in every key, and she placed her hands on it and breathed. The congregation settled. The preacher nodded at her from the front. She played the first hymn. She played it the way she had played the last night at the Silver Lantern. Not for the room, not for any audience, but this time, the person she was playing for was not the girl in the hollow who needed to be kept alive until something changed. That girl was here. That girl was sitting at this piano in a mountain town she had chosen on a September morning she had earned with $12 of legitimate debt, being settled one fair week at a time, and her mother's Bible in her boarding room on the nightstand where she could see it from the bed. She was playing for herself, because she wanted to, because the music was hers. Caleb Morgan sat in the third pew from the back, which was where a man sits who is not quite sure yet if he belongs in a pew, but is making the effort. He had his hat on his knee and his hands folded, and he was looking at the front of the church with the steady expression he wore for most things. But when the music started, he closed his eyes, the way a man closes his eyes when something reaches a part of him he doesn't usually allow to be reached, and he stayed that way through the whole first hymn. Emily saw it from the piano. She played all the way through to the end without stopping, clean and full and unafraid, and when the last note settled into the September air of the Grady's Crossing Methodist Church, she sat for just a moment in the resonance of it, the way good music holds in a room for just a heartbeat after the playing stops, as if the air doesn't want to let it go. Then she lifted her hands from the keys. Outside, the Virginia mountains stood in their September blue, unchanged and enormous, and entirely indifferent to the smallness of human contracts and the smallness of men who made them. And in a kitchen 4 miles up a trail that was unmaintained and largely theoretical. A wood stove was lit, and a cabin that had been silent for 12 years was not quite as silent as it used to be, because someone had left a hairpin on the windowsill and a Bible on the table, and the smell of coffee had gotten into the walls in a way that did not belong to a man alone. Henry Carter was still in Blackwater Hollow, in the same chair on the same porch, with the same bottle and the same grief and the same mountain above him that had watched him lose everything he loved and then sell the last thing he had. That was his to carry. Emily knew that. She had thought about writing to him and had not done it yet, and she did not know when she would, and she had decided that not knowing was something she was allowed to sit with for as long as she needed to. Clara had come forward to Simmons the week after Emily left Beckley. Rose had come with her. Simmons had filed. The hearing was set for October. Emily had written her account and sent it to Simmons to be used as supporting testimony in the careful, clear handwriting her mother had taught her and her school teacher had refined, and she had sealed it and given it to Caleb to post, and she had felt sending it the specific satisfaction of a debt paid that had nothing to do with money. Some things you owe not to people, but to the version of yourself that survived something. You pay those debts by making the survival mean something. She was making it mean something. She closed the piano cover, and the congregation began to file out into the September morning. And Caleb was the last one out, the way he always would be, not because he was reluctant to leave, but because he had grown up knowing that the last one out makes sure the door is properly closed. He stopped beside the piano, and he looked at her, and he said, "You play like you've been waiting to play like that for a long time." 8 weeks, she said, "at least." "More than that, I reckon," he said. She looked at him. "Yes," she said, "more than that." He offered his hand, not the handshake of the courthouse steps, but the hand of a man who has decided he is going to keep showing up, and who is offering that as plainly and without ornament as he did everything else, because he was a man who had no gift for ornament and no patience for things that required it. His hand was calloused from the mountains and steady and entirely honest. She took it. They walked out of the Grady's Crossing Methodist Church into the September morning, and the mountains were blue and enormous around them, and the air had the first faint edge of autumn in it, the warning that summer was getting ready to let go, and Emily Carter walked into it with her head up and her bad leg making its familiar mark on the ground, and Caleb Morgan's hand warm around hers. She had been told she was worth $2. She had refused the price, and now the whole mountain sky was hers, and she intended to keep it,